Here in Europe, they're attempting to do contact tracing through apps. The apps are voluntary, they don't force you to do it. So there's not a huge user base, but there's pretty high user base, high enough apparently. I'm using one called Corona Warn app, and when I open it up, today it tells me I've had 2 encounters with low-risk people for coronavirus. And what the app tells me is that sometime in the past week, my Bluetooth on my phone has talked to the Bluetooth on another person's phone who was later tested positive for corona. Now the app tells me because their diagnoses were so much later than the time our phones talk to each other, it doesn't recommend I get tested or quarantine or anything like that. Coincidentally, I have been tested. I've been tested 3 times now for coronavirus. I've been negative every time so far. Touch wood. That doesn't mean that I'm immune or anything like that. The reason I'm sharing this with you is because this app, I think, is interesting, and for a lot of people, it's very scary. If there are private companies, public companies, if the government has access to your health information, what could they do with that? Well, they could force you to lock yourself in your room. They could not hire you for a job. And that's not just coronavirus. What if it's diabetes? What if it's a heart condition? What about if it's cancer? So many different conditions that could cause big problems for people. Again, I'm not a privacy person personally, but I believe in it for everyone else. I mention that today because the topic of our podcast is the human genome, genetics, and genetic testing, as I'm sure you're aware, has exploded all around the world with companies like Ancestry.com and 23andMe and loads of other DNA testing companies. You can order a little kit on the internet. They'll send it to you. You swab the back of your throat or you send them a chunk of your hair. I believe it's usually a swab in the back of your throat. And they tell you where your ancestors are from. And this all sounds kind of fun. It's like a horoscope or a personality test. It's getting to know yourself on a deeper level. But here's what happens. We don't really know what happens. Depending on the company, we don't know what happens to that data on the back end. And while that sounds like a big conspiracy theory, it is not at all a conspiracy theory because some of these companies are openly communicating with government agencies, including the FBI. Now, fortunately for me, I am not on the international most wanted list. So again, these privacy concerns mean nothing to me. I couldn't care less if everything I have, all my data is published freely. I really don't care, but I completely understand why people should have a right to their privacy, and it's really, really complicated and confusing. What if you had a child as a teenager who you gave up for adoption, and it was the best, most responsible thing you could do given the circumstances, and then suddenly, in your 70s, your child gets access to your DNA records and you're reunited. Is that their legal right? I have no idea. Is that okay? I'm not sure. Should you have control over your data? I think so. I'm not sure. In any case, these companies are amassing tens of millions of records. It might be hundreds of millions at this point. I don't think it's that high, but let's say tens of millions of DNA samples and sequences. And they're building big data sets in the same way that Facebook and Google have big data sets about your behavior. So on the back end, Facebook knows that you clicked on Ed Sheeran's video. They know that you watch Fox News or Now This. They know that you have a propensity to watch Comedy Central videos that could they know all that stuff about you. These genetic companies have a little bit more troubling information. They know who you are from bricks and mortar perspective in a way that's not going to change. There might be a day when you unsubscribe from Now This or you unsubscribe from Fox News. There might be a day when you change your mind and you're no longer into Ed Sheeran. That could happen. But there will never be a day when you are not you, which means that Facebook data set could age poorly. Your DNA set will not age at all. That's you forever and ever. And a lot of us are voluntarily swabbing our throat and sending that information off to these private companies. It's kind of like the wild, wild west. If you're new here, it's the Lucas Rockwood Show. I'm a yoga teacher, a teacher trainer, a serial entrepreneur. I'm the father of 3 kids, but first and foremost, I am a student. I like to learn things. So I go out into the world of health and wellness, and I try to find medical doctors and PhDs and researchers and yoga teachers and fitness professionals. I try to bring their best work here for you on the show, so hopefully we can all live more fulfilled lives. If you enjoy this show, it means a lot to me if you share the show on social media. Tag me. It's at Lucas Rockwood. You can send me questions for the show at Lucas Rockwood on Instagram. And last but not least, if you are listening on your phone, scroll down and leave a rating and review in whatever app you're listening on. Thanks for listening. Enjoy. So hello and welcome everyone. Today's show is called Get to Know Your Genes, and I am joined here with Yael Joffe. Yael's a dietitian, a PhD from the University of Cape Town, where she explored the genetics and nutrition of obesity in South African women. She's the co-author of 3 books, It's Not Just Your Genes, the SNP Journal, and Genes to Plate. She's the founder of 3x4 Genetic, and you can learn more about her work while we're chatting here at 3x4genetics.com. Yael, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Lucas. Great to be here.
For people listening, there's a lot of talk about genetics. People in the US are using 23andMe. Here in Europe, they use a different service. And it seemed like there was a big peak in interest. And then even though the initial fanfare around genetic testing seems to have died down, behind the scenes, it seems like more people are doing it than ever. And so before we talk about testing and what all of that means specifically, maybe you can help people and me understand the difference between genetics and epigenetics, because I think a lot of people think that genetics are kind of driving everything and they feel like they don't have much control over their life.
Okay, that's a great place to start. So when we talk about genetics, we're talking about our code, our DNA code, which is like our blueprint. So in our DNA, we have this kind of language of genetics, which are these letters, exactly like the English language, where we have letters, we have words, we have sentences, we have stories. We have exactly the same thing in genetics, which sits inside every single cell of ours, which is the story of ourselves and how we respond to the world. What did we inherit from our parents and their parents that defines who we are and what is our response to the world? And this is our code. Now, the word epigenetics means outside of genetics. So when we talk about epigenetics, I like to think of it in a much, much simpler way, which is really our daily choices and really our environment. So I have a code that determines how optimally I live in the world and how I respond to my world. But how I live in the world and the choices I make will influence my genes. Now, the difference is one is a code, like what is written in the book of us. The other one is like having a house full of light switches. So the decisions we make, like the foods we eat, how we manage our stress, the exercise we do, where we live, switches on and switches off genes in our body. And this is really the nature of what we call epigenetics. And epigenetics really is about gene behavior. If I choose to eat this food versus that food, I'm going to switch on these genes and those genes. And our body's like an engine. And it's constantly having genes going on and off to make it work. And sometimes genes go on and stay on too long, like in inflammation. Sometimes they don't go on at all. Sometimes they don't switch off. So this is really the difference. One is about our code of what we bring to the party. The other one is the decisions we make that change how our genes behave. And these two together will manifest in our health and how we, and kind of our quality of life.
And if I understand correctly, when geneticists are studying this, identical twins are kind of the gold standard, right? And so when people look at twins, and obviously we would expect very similar outcomes, are there anomalous situations that are, do you see twins where one of them has gone completely one direction, another has gone another direction, in terms of understanding how the epigenetic trigger can be pulled in different directions?
Absolutely. So you're 100% right. Like the gold standard of genetic research is identical twins. So identical twins have exactly the DNA sequence, the same one. So their code, which is the first thing I spoke about, is the same. But what they do in this research is they especially love it when they have twins who were brought up in different environments. So imagine you have identical twins. One was brought up in kind of middle America, McDonald's, no exercise, lots of TV time. And another child was brought up in Japan, for example, living off fermented foods and a kind of a different environment. They can then see, even though their genes were the same, how did their body manifest? How did their health manifest? And that's that's why we always start to learn about genetics. It's always a starting point. It gives us an idea that things like obesity or diabetes or heart disease or depression, anxiety, any of these things, how much of that is coming from our genes and how much of it is coming from our environment, because nothing is entirely genetic and nothing is entirely the decisions we make. And the excitement of this area and the potential is understanding how for every person, that ratio of contribution is going to be different.
When I hear information about genetics, it kind of confuses me. So, like, if I understand correctly, we share like 50% of the DNA with a banana or something like this. And when we look at like, and when we look at like humans to humans, like my brother and I, we share so much similar DNA. I guess it's hard for me to understand. Is like 5 basis points a statistically significant difference? Is 3 percentage points, all these mice studies that are then translated into humans? It's really difficult for me to understand. What does that mean if we're, 95% the same or 98% the same as some chimpanzees or orangutans or these kind of things? What is that? Is that 2%? Is that 2% the only thing that matters, or is it negligible? Will the monkeys someday cross over and start working on computers, or how do you think about that difference?
Sure, no one's ever asked me that question before. So it's always funny when we talk about the banana, that we have a lot of DNA, but really it's really about protein. So there's some proteins that a banana makes that we can make.
I see.
But that's really, and obviously chimpanzees is a different story, because chimpanzees and humans have a great deal in common genetically.
Yeah.
And that's no surprise to us, right? The banana thing's a surprise. The chimpanzees is not a surprise, because, when we talk about evolution, when we talk about Darwin, when we talk about survival of the fittest, what we're actually talking about is genetic variation. So if we can put it another way, 99.9%, you and I are genetically identical.
Yep.
Right? So only at 0.1% we're different from each other, and yet we are very different from each other.
Yeah.
So I always say, like, rather than get confused by what are those proteins? Remember, DNA makes proteins. So let me just say that DNA makes proteins. What are those proteins that a banana or a chimpanzee would have similar to us? What is the 0.1% that makes me and you respond to our world so differently? And we can have a look at a chimpanzee, which is going to be like 98% the same as you and I. And we can kind of get our head around that, because that's part of evolution. So I try not to go down the banana route, but rather think about,
sure.
Which really throws catch among pigeons. What is it about our differences that is interesting to us? And I think that's where genetics becomes valuable to us as individuals, is understanding how we exist differently in the world and why we respond differently in the world. And rather keeping, and that's around and the other thing I just want to say, in case you don't ask a question, is you'll hear this often in the media. They'll say, like, 50% of genetics, 50% of obesity is genetic, and 50% are the decisions you make, or 95% of cancer is coming from your genes, or 95%. And whenever you hear these kind of blanket percentages that they throw at us, it must be really a red flag for all of us, because it's not possible. And the reason it's not possible is because we all live on the spectrum with genetics. So I'll give, if you don't mind me giving you an example, let's talk about obesity and weight. So we know, well, when I studied dietetics, my first degree, and I was told, quite some time ago, everyone must have this amount of calories, and this amount of calories needs to be expended. And if we do that, then everyone will lose weight and everyone will be at a happy weight and everything will be wonderful. But of course, that's like the greatest untruth. And what we've discovered is that we all respond to food energy in a completely different way. And as genetic research has grown, especially in this area, we are starting to understand that genetics influences every single element of how we engage with our bodies and our weight and food. So I might be a very hungry person. You and I might eat the same meal. I might need double the portion you need. You might be full halfway through. that is not about greediness or lack of willpower. That is really about our body signaling, which is coming from genetics. So we're starting to understand that there's some of us in the world who will reduce our calories, we will exercise a lot, and we still won't lose weight. So how can I say to you that, genetically, like 80% for you is diet and 20% is genetics? Because in actual fact, for each of us, we have a different percentage.
It seems like, I think statistics, I think this has been the year of statistics that have been manipulated, but I always find statistics so troubling because, similarly, it'd be like looking at a friendship or a marriage and trying to say, yes, well, 20% is quality time and 20% is work productivity. Like, it's very, how on earth could you ever get something that would be that predictive? I mean, I understand people need to ballpark and get an idea. Speaking of timely conversations, I know that you're in South Africa. I'm here in Barcelona. South Africa has huge infection rate, very low death rate. I spent a long time living in Southeast Asia. My friends and colleagues in Thailand are having a very similar experience. COVID, it's just doesn't seem to be spreading there, which is bizarre. I'm curious. Obviously, it's way too early. Nobody really knows. But if you were to hypothesize from a genetic, which is dangerous, of course, but from a genetic perspective, what do you suspect? Do you think there's a genetic element, or do you think it's a antibody element? If you had to take a guess.
Wow, you asked very interesting questions. So, well, first of all, the jury's out on whether our statistics are accurate, but let's just say that. But you're right. I mean, we definitely have a lower death rate, and so if I had to choose and hazard a guess, I think the latter. So I think it's about our exposures here. Being a first third world country, we have a lot more exposure to pathogens, viruses, bacteria, all kinds of pathogens in our world. Not so much in my affluent, privileged one, but in the general population. So I think there's definitely that. It's like they say, one of the most dangerous things is kind of the hygienic eating of Marks and Spencer, and we definitely don't have that here. So there is some discussion about vaccination. I'm not convinced about that. That we've had vaccines that the US haven't had. But so I do think. Look, I also think people are wearing masks in South Africa, to be honest. And so that's my one issue. And the other one is I do think there's that exposure to pathogens over our lifetimes that have made us a bit more robust. But I think, as you say, I think only time will tell, and history will look back and be able to judge what's really happening.
Yeah. Let's see. So let's loop back to your topic about weight loss. You started out as a dietitian. How did that push you into genetics, or was it just a natural jump for you? Or was there something about your work with diet and weight loss nutrition that just kind of forced you down that path?
I did dietetics. I actually did architecture, and truly loved architecture until my grandmother died from cancer. And that was a real turning point for me. It was like, this is not good, and I need some answers, and I need to understand why she died and this terrible disease, and why didn't anyone help her, and why didn't she eat the right diet. So I went in search of a degree to study health, and at the time there was no degree. This is the 1980s, and so the closest degree I found was dietetics. So I left architecture, moved to dietetics, and I think in week 3 of dietetics I already realized that it was a disaster. I remember being told that chocolate cake and ice cream was a perfectly excellent food for a patient in hospital, because it had calories and protein and, So I was just horrified. And I knew that what I was studying in dietetics had absolutely nothing to do with health. But there wasn't really an alternative at the time. So I finished my degrees, qualified as a dietitian, and then kind of spent 10 years trying to leave dietetics because I was so disillusioned by what I'd found. And then living in the UK in London, I came across the first nutrition genetic startup company actually in the world in Southampton. And they said, do you want to come and work with us? We need a dietitian who knows about genetics. I was like, I know nothing about genetics, but it sounds like you're onto something, and I'm very excited about what you're telling me. And so I went to join them in 2000. So this is 3 years before the human genome was mapped. Knew nothing for the first 4 years. And then went back to university to study a PhD in genetics, because I realized very early on that the answers that I'd been looking for about my grandmother around why she's died from cancer, why would we treat her, what we could have done better, were not sitting in dietetics at all, but actually was sitting in an understanding of who she was, how she had, how her lifetime had manifested in cancer because of her genes plus her lifestyle, and that nutrition had to be done differently. So I actually have been I am a dietitian, and I work with a lot of brilliant dietitians. But dietetics as a profession is really flawed and has a lot to answer for.
And when you say flaw, what is the first thing that comes to mind? Is it the ice cream in the hospital kind of mentality? Is it the calories in, calories out mentality? What?
It's it's calories in, calories out, but it's not even that. It's two things. It's disease centered. So I've been in functional medicine for 20 years. So anything that starts with a disease and works backwards, I'm not a fan. Yeah. But also it's based on epidemiology. So it's based on population. That every single person should have the same calories, the same protein, the same. So for me, it's a lazy profession where they haven't made the effort to go and understand what is the root cause of disease and what's causing it, and rather saying, well, here's a label for diabetes and there's a label, and we'll come up with a diet plan. So I think, and don't get me wrong, there's some brilliant dietitians who've surpassed their degrees and gone on to study integrative or functional medicine and truly are doing brilliant nutrition. And the naturopaths are doing great. But dietetics as a profession, I came out of home economics, and I don't believe they ever truly evolved past that.
Wow. Yeah, I wasn't aware of that. So coincidentally, I'm sitting here with a bandage on my arm. I just got blood tested earlier this morning. And when I get my blood test back, inevitably I spend hours searching on Google trying to get some idea of how to understand reference charts for different biomarkers, whether it's homocysteine or C-reactive protein or whatever it is. And the reason I'm bringing that up is because when we jump into genetic testing, it's like it's very new science. It's a whole can of worms. I certainly don't understand any of it. You're neck deep in this. How much do we know? How much can we know? And how much of this information is actually actionable? So let me give you a real life example. My mother was here in Barcelona visiting me. It's probably 4 or 5 years ago. And we gave her a genetic test for, I believe it was her birthday or something like that. And then we get the email with the results. We all kind of stared at it for 5 minutes. And then we said, okay, we're not sure what any of this means. And so it's kind of like data overload for people who are getting this kind of information. And from you on the clinician back-end analysis perspective, what do we know? What can we know? How do we attempt to even sift through the big data of oneself?
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly the problem. So there's you started off in your first comment in the introduction. You said 23andMe was a really big deal. There was a huge excitement about genetics. Then it kind of was not so much excitement. And part of that is around exactly what you just experienced with your mother, which is if we cannot translate and utilize and make recommendations based on genetics, then we're paying for data. It's just expensive data. It doesn't matter if it's $79 data or €40 data. It's still just data. So my great challenge in my career in genetics is to say, how do we identify what is useful genetic information? Because there's a lot of noise in genetics, as you explained.
Sure.
How do we then put it into such a way that it will be useful for you, for the end user?
Yeah.
And so I actually don't work direct to consumer. I haven't for the longest time. So my company, we believe that practitioners, dietitians, doctors, specialists, naturopaths, chiropractors, dentists, it doesn't matter, were not trained in genetics at university. They do not know how to interpret genetics, because genetics is not something that they should make a decision on by itself. Genetics is something that they should build into their knowledge base to add into their toolbox to be able to help them make better decisions with their patients. So you can't have a genetic testing company without having an education company. And So I had an education company, and then I built a genetics testing company, and I put the education company in because we have to go and actually raise the bar of practitioners to teach them the question you've just asked, which is what is clinically useful? What is useful for me to make better recommendations to my patient, to understand them better? And personally, it's extremely difficult for you as a non-geneticist, or even if you were a geneticist, as a non-clinical translational geneticist, to get that report and make a meaningful recommendation to your mother. So genetics has not delivered the promise that it made. In 2003, it said genetics will change health, it'll change everything. But the way it's been translated and delivered has actually failed the individual. Because without having very, very careful selection of what genes we test, without working out why they're useful, and then without training practitioners how to integrate it into their practice, we're not actually doing any justice to genetics. And what we're doing is we're kind of diluting genetics with the good stuff is lost in the noise. And people like yourself are sitting with this data and saying, what must I do with this? And you put it in the drawer, and that's the end of it.
Yeah, I know different countries have different laws around what can be stated by testing centers and things like this. I'm for whatever reason, I'm not a privacy person. I don't care. I have COVID tracking apps on my phone. I don't care. I publish my blood tests online. I'm not sure. Maybe I'm just reckless, but I do totally understand that there's people who do care, and I respect that. And I understand that I have only a topical understanding of this, but from what I understand right now, there are issues around people, their genetic data getting dropped into databases where adopted children are suddenly finding their parents, where criminals are getting pulled from databases. And I only became aware of that this year. And I'm just wondering if that's going to push all this genetic testing back into the shadows. What are your thoughts or concerns around those kind of issues?
Yeah, I mean, it really only happened, it's kind of this year and last year with that issue. And you understand that 95% of all genetic testing that's been done in the world is ancestry. So companies like 23andMe, Ancestry.com, DNA are testing ancestry. And they do it at a very low price because what they want is data. And then they build these databases, and because these databases have become so big over the last, they've probably done 20 million people in total, we're starting being able to have this situation where, exactly as you described it, I thought you were my dad, but you're not, and I'm related to you, and, so it's a major, major issue. And I think it's big. It's been these big ancestry companies not imagining what could be and what could happen. And there's definitely been a kickback from end users of saying, like, we have it in our company, every single person, what are you doing with my DNA? Are you destroying it? How are you storing my details? What happens to my DNA when, and one of the things we teach practitioners and end users is, what are the questions you need to ask of a company or of a test before you do it? Because, it's you're not privacy worried. I'm actually like you. It's just too overwhelming to try and protect every single element of things. So I think it's an inevitability in my opinion. So I'm happy to share, but I do understand people's concern. And that's part of the problem we have in the industry at the moment, which is there are so many cowboy genetic testing companies who are not doing it for the right reasons. Well, it's not even that they're trying to exploit the DNA data. They just don't take it seriously enough. So a lot of it is about, if you're going to do the test, you've got to understand not that they're selling your data, because I don't think it's that. It's that if you do an ancestry test and you're going into a database, there is a chance that you're going to be connected. And I think, it's again about educating people to understand what they're signing up for, what the pros are and what the cons are. But this is going to be our reality. In China, they are testing at birth. In one of the cities in China, every single child that's born gets a full genome sequence done. Ultimately, China will have genetics on. Now in China, they can do that because they don't need any permission on every single person. So I think there's an inevitability to our genetic code being part of who we are. But it is something that is extremely overwhelming for many people, and we need to navigate it with care. And I think governments around the world are starting to put regulation in place to be able to manage it better, which wasn't there in the last 10 years.
Yeah, it's interesting. If we unlocked our phone with our DNA, that would be interesting. When you get it, one last question before we wrap up. When you get excited about the future, do you see? There was all this talk about getting one drop of blood to get all of our blood work in the Walgreens and all this kind of stuff, and that turned out to be smoke and mirrors. And Theranos, yeah. When you get excited about the future of quantified self, of measuring, of with genetic perspective specifically, how far off do you think we are from, like an American consumer being able to rock up to Walgreens or CVS? And because you mentioned the number 20 million. That's a lot of people, but that's not very many people. How long before that's just part of our data set? You have your ID number, you have your genome sequenced. Realistically, do you think that's 10 years out, 20 years out, 3 years out?
No, I don't think it's 3 years out. I definitely don't think it's 3 years out. So one is technology, which you've spoken about, which is kind of the Theranos conversation, which I think will happen. And I think it's on its way. And I think there's some companies who are actually doing it, not smoke and mirrors. And I think that in the next couple of years, we'll see that kind of point of care, go to Walmart and be able to get your DNA or your blood type done. In terms of complete adoption of genetics into mainstream population, I do think it's 10 to 20 years.
Wow.
I think we've got a way to go. Yeah. And this, as I say, like in China where you're forced to, I think voluntary, I think the next 10 years are going to be quite interesting to see how it plays out. I think in 20 years, everyone will have a DNA passport where we'll be defined our code. Yeah.
Indistinguishable. Who we are is who we are. Yeah. That makes sense. This is a great conversation for people listening who are interested in getting tested, interested in following you. You've got a bunch of great lectures online, and you offer a lot of services. How can people find you?
So we are actually only working in the US and South Africa at the moment for testing. For education, we're obviously online all the time, but it's 3x4genetics.com and or Yael at 3x4genetics.com.
For the first time ever, Yoga Alliance has opened up their bar standard, their 200-hour certification for online-only training. Because of COVID-19, obviously, we can't train in person. And so the 200-hour training, if you don't know, is kind of the gold standard. It's what about 95% of yoga teachers teaching in studios or fitness centers or at home or privately, wherever. It's about what 95% of people use for their teaching credential. And historically needed to spend about 3 weeks in person, which was great. We had people coming from all over the world to Barcelona to train with us. And so when COVID happened, obviously we went online, and we were online only. We always had fusion courses. We were really nervous about the change. Could we do it? Could we actually train people only virtually without hands on toes and these kinds of things? And I have to say, not only has it gone well, in many ways it's gone better than our in-person course. Why? First reason is we have more time, so instead of cramming everything into 3 weeks, we take a full 8 weeks. Second reason is the technology has some real advantages. We can zoom in on students, we do hot seats, we do workshops, we have quite a large training team giving feedback on a daily basis. So you join a live class, you get feedback about your practice, you get up on camera and you teach. It's incredibly interactive, the community is really strong. The short story is I'm really excited about this. It's working great. We have a new batch starting here very, very shortly to learn about our upcoming course. We've already got a great group of students signed up, and the trainers and I are excited. Go to yogateacherscollege.com and we'll share more details. So if you're thinking about becoming a yoga teacher, if you'd like to make the most of this COVID time, it's a great time to get certified at home. Barb on Instagram has a question this week. She says, Lucas, I know that you used to lead juice fasts. I saw an old ad probably 8 years ago for a retreat in Thailand, and I'm wondering if you ever do those again. I appreciate the question and interest, Barb. Yeah, I led juice cleanses in a bunch of different places. In New York, in Bangkok, in Koh Samui, in the Philippines we did one. Probably somewhere else that I'm forgetting. I used to do them here in Barcelona. And juice fasting is fun. It feels good. It's challenging. It's interesting. I'll tell you why I stopped. So when you go on a juice fast, we'll usually have something like 6 or even 8 juices throughout the day. and we would dilute them heavily with water so you don't get hit with such a big whack of sugar. But inevitably, we still end up getting quite a bit of fructose specifically, and quite a bit of carbohydrate in the day. But specifically that high load of fructose, a significant number of people react badly to that. The vast majority of people who do a juice fast feel good, but those same people would feel really, really good on a green juice fast, and those same people would feel really good on a broth fast. And so over the years, I have migrated away from juice fasting and doing broth fasts instead. And I find it personally a lot more enjoyable in terms of my blood sugar levels and mood and balance. And I find that people stick to it a lot better. Somehow savory foods seem to be more satiating. They seem to keep you a little bit more satisfied. But I have also moved away from fasting protocols in general and really laid an emphasis on meal timing instead. I find that the binge and purge cycle of people who get into fasting is mentally not very healthy. People get into this attitude where they're dirty and they feel like they're dirty, they feel like they're broken. Every 3 months they want to clean themselves out and starve themselves. And I didn't really feel like that was the best way to approach health. So really we started advocating instead meal timing, which is sometimes referred to as time-restricted eating or intermittent fasting. Intermittent fasting is a very exaggerated name for what we're talking about, which is really just a 12, 14, or ideally a 16-hour break between dinner and breakfast. The thing I like about this, Barb, and for everyone listening, is that it's really simple. Most people can do it pretty effortlessly, and it's something that you can make part of your lifestyle, not just something you do every few months. But I don't want to discourage you. If you're interested in experimenting with juice fasting, I would say go for it. But I would definitely encourage you to stay away from the sweeter juices, focus on green juices, and also mostly just drink a whole bunch of water. Hope that's helpful. Melissa on Instagram says, Lucas, I've had a hip replacement recently. I'd like to get into stretching, specifically deep stretching like you teach with Gravity Yoga. Is it safe? I get a question about hip or knee replacements probably every other day, if not every day. And I guess on the one hand, I think it's really exciting that we have this medical technology where we can replace parts, right? And I'm really excited about the fact that as I get older and as we all get older, I think there's going to be a lot more replacement parts available. I'm hoping that in the future they're even, we get to regrow things. That would be really exciting. If we could regrow our meniscus, or if we could regrow articular cartilage, that would be amazing. And I think it's pretty possible. Those are pretty simple tissues. And so anyway, I hope that's where the future is going. In the short term, Melissa, hip replacements, knee replacements, pretty common. And here's the thing. I've had so many students find success using Gravity Yoga after knee and hip replacements, but in all cases, go to your doctor, make sure you get the clear, make sure everybody's situation is different, right? You want to make sure that you have the bone density, you want to make sure that it's not contraindicated, because of course, with a hip replacement, the name of the game is let's put off that next hip replacement for as long as possible, and maybe you never need another one. But the trajectory of people getting hip replacements, of course, is you get one and then 15 years later you get another. And so you want to do everything you can to slow down that process. And you don't want to do something that's really aggressive like Gravity Yoga without all the proper care in place. And the other thing that I usually recommend people do is two things. Make sure you're not taking any painkillers, and that means ibuprofen included when you're stretching, so that you can hear your body talking to you and say, hey, Melissa, stop it. And the second thing I encourage you to do is be more gentle than you would be on yourself pre-hip replacement. And so if normally you could go to 7, 8 out of 10, go to 5 or 6 out of 10 and just be gentle and take care of that wonderful replacement part that you've got. Hope that helps. Thanks for listening to The Lucas Rockwood Show. If you enjoy the podcast, I have 2 asks of you. Number 1, share the show on social media with your friends and tag me. My handle is @LucasRockwood. Number 2 is please leave a rating and review in whatever app you're listening on. And last but not least, before you go, if you'd like to be on my mailing list, every week I send out information about the podcast, behind the scenes stuff, announcements of online classes and special events. I email about once a week. You can do that at yogabody.com/sign me up. And right now we have a free breathing worksheet on that page as well. It's yogabody.com/sign me up. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you next week.